Our last presentation of the afternoon is from Michael Scott Cuthbert. Michael Scott Cuthbert, Associate Professor of Music at MIT, is a musicologist who has worked extensively on music of the 14th century and computational musicology. Cuthbert's research lab has produced Music 21, an open source toolkit for computer-aided musical analysis, which has an installed user base in the thousands. Cuthbert's awards include the Rome Prize in Medieval Studies and a fellowship in music at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. Cuthbert received his BA and PhD from Harvard University. Prior to coming to MIT, Cuthbert was on the faculties of Smith and Mount Holyoke colleges. His article, quote, "Tipping the Iceberg, Missing Italian Polyphony from the Age of Schism," used computer simulations to contradict the unquestioned assumption that most written medieval music has been lost. He is finishing a book titled, quote, "Ars Mutandi, Italian Sacred Music in the Age of Plague and Schism." His presentation today is titled Searching in Digital Medieval Score Databases, Moving from Metadata to Big Data. Please welcome Michael Cuthbert.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today to members of a profession that I revere with admiration and awe. I am not a librarian, but I am a librarian groupie. I shouldn't say that without presenting at least some bona fides. For instance, I do have a library catalog homepage for my personal library, which is cataloged in US Mark, an older version, I'm sorry. And I designed a search engine for my own library, which shows me where things are, and an online field editing system. So that's something. But I think the main thing that makes me a library groupie is that I think a lot about sources and metadata about sources. In my Music 21 computer music research project, for instance, we've spent a lot of time considering how to encode aspects such as various levels of uncertainty about the date and provenance of a piece, and like these approximate symbols and stuff. And I like to think about the line where metadata and data blur, and the importance of pushing the envelope along those lines. And that's what a lot of today's paper is about. One of the projects I think a lot of in terms of pushing the boundary between metadata and data is the RISM project, a decade-long attempt at cataloging musical sources and other musical works of the past whose US office is at Harvard. Many of the early volumes of RISM B4 project included graphical incipits for individual works, later moving to a numeric code to indicate the initial motion of one voice in order to save space on the page. Other RISM projects combined the advantages of both searchable and graphical incipit encoding using plain and easy code to give both a computer encodable and graphically renderable version of the incipit. More recently, primarily in fields involving text and images, presenting and preserving snippets alone of information has not been seen as sufficient. Repositories you probably know, such as Project Gutenberg, have preserved the text fully searchable for many, many books. The Thesaurus Musicarum Latinarium has preserved a smaller but still large number of full text resources specializing in Latin music theory. The enormous project, Google Books, has gone further, preserving not only the searchable text, if often with errors in the OCR, but also the original images of the book. And finally, projects such as IMSLP, founded here in Cambridge, have exploded in presenting hundreds of thousands of scores with full images online. But unlike the previous projects, the music of this score is not, with a few exceptions, searchable. Only the metadata, specifically encoded and not always up to music librarianship standards, is able to be found. Why am I so interested in musical search? It's because I spend so much of my research time trying to identify small fragments and make connections among sources, hoping to use all the resources and tools that are now at our disposal. And that's where I'll talk a little bit about my own research. There are fewer than 100 known surviving sources of Italian polyphonic music from the period from 1340 to 1420, alternatively called the Italian Ars Nova, the Trecento, or the Ars Mutandi, or changing style. And there are probably fewer than 400 sources from this period from all over Europe. From the times I have been fortunate enough to discover a new source, I know something of the process that begins at this moment. The quick transcription and photography of what is there, the comparison of this source's works to pieces in other principal sources where concordances don't jump out as immediately obvious. Now, occasionally a new piece will be clearly labeled with a composer's name and a legible incipit, but much more often, newly discovered works are faded, fragmentary, or palimpsest. And even after the best digital reconstructions, such as those I learned from Julia Craig McFeely, transcriptions can still be hard to reconstruct. And then the problem is that the time available to conduct this work is always greatly constrained. Discoveries usually come while you're searching for something else, something more pressing at the time. So there's always more to be done with each new source, and always a feeling that something has been missed. A lot of my prior work involved trying to find these connections manually. This sometimes involved a search through the 25 volumes of polyphonic music of the 14th century, the 7 volumes of early 15th century music, and the approximately 3 volumes worth of material discovered since these series were completed. Occasionally hand searches work. I'm very proud that I found all these things by hand, but whether they do or don't, searching through a stack like that can take days or weeks or more. But the problem of finding one piece in the haystack of printed sources is multiplied immensely when many potential concordances await discovery. A researcher might hold 3 or 4 fragments in his or her head at a time and search for them in about the same amount of time it takes you to search for one thing. But when you're trying to find hundreds of potential citations, dozens of searches through the same repertory have to take place, needing months or years of dedicated drudgery. And so much can slip through. Searching for all possible quotations among all possible pieces would take far too long for even a team of researchers. Because as the number of pieces to be studied increases, the number of pairs of pieces increases by the square of the increase. Thus, to study whether any of the thousands of pieces are cited or quoted in any other piece, millions of pairs of pieces have to be compared to each other. For the 14th century, that's about 3 million pairs of pieces. It's clearly impossible for any scholar or team to systematically comb through all of these pairs to look for citations. And I'm lucky. 14th century scholars have it quite easy compared to scholars working in later centuries. Each successive century has about 10 times as much more music as the preceding. What would have been a week's search in the 14th century repertoire might stretch into a year for the 15th century. This would turn into a lifetime's labor for the 16th century, moving on to a millennia's work for the 17th century, and so on for the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Computers excel at the type of repetitive, tedious, and exacting work necessary for repeated comparisons. To automate the process of comparing works in order to identify unknown ones, I first needed a computer-encoded repository of pieces. In 2011, I launched the Electronic Medieval Music Score Archive Project, or MSAP. It's a digital repository that encodes the complete corpus of 14th and early 15th century polyphonic music in Music XML and other computer-readable formats. It's available immediately with an access agreement, and I hope to make it fully open source as soon as I get this paper out. About 2% of the works in MSAP had never been transcribed, but the rest were already encoded from published transcriptions. So the encoding process is pretty straightforward. I take a modern edition of the piece, such as polyphonic music of the 14th century's version of this unique French song, En Canefeu, and then I translate it through Finale or something into a computer edition. And from there, into Music XML. So that's the Music XML code for the first 2 measures of this piece. Well, some scholars have suggested to me, or insisted, that it would have been better to start anew with fresh transcriptions made from the original sources. Encoding works at that level of fidelity adds little to the accuracy of searches, I can say now, but it would have made the project 10 times longer and 10 times as expensive. Even at this level of accuracy, it took about 5 years and $40,000 to complete. So it immediately raises the question, is it worth creating quality digital score databases for scholars and libraries if they're so time-consuming and expensive to create? And to answer that, it depends on what tools exist to make use of full-text musical databases. So the tools. because the encoding of tons of pieces does nothing for itself for scholars, except saving the occasional trip to the bookshelf. But in order to search and make matches across the pieces, we needed software that could index music, find all possible similarities, and display them for confirmation. This is the main reason that 10 years ago I created the Music 21 Computational Research Toolkit. I'll just say a little bit about it. It's an open source Python programming library that's available online. Many people use it primarily for transferring from one music format to another, but it does other things, such as here it can label how strong each beat is in an excerpt from Bach, which you could certainly do faster by hand. But the cool thing about a computer is this is how you do it for one piece. You change that first line where we grab one piece into a for loop that goes through every single chorale, and in about 5 minutes it does it for every piece. And it's built on encoding lots of small pieces of knowledge and then moving to more complex concepts. And so I've used the toolkit in the past to answer questions on full text music databases such as are higher notes louder? In Beethoven, there's no correlation. What's the difference between how Schumann uses notes from Robert Schumann from Chopin? Schumann's pitches tend to be neatly distributed in a little perfect bell curve. Chopin, when he finds that G sharp he really likes, he keeps using it in that octave. It kind of looks like a badly planned city like Abu Dhabi. By the way, you can always make three-dimensional visualizations. These are really good for getting grants, but I can never see anything in them. I'm really interested in geographic imaging, so trying to figure out how different parts of China, how folk songs different in different parts of China. Going inland and going north has a real difference in the profile of, let's say, major and minor sevenths and similar things. And it allows me to search through pieces. So this is a little excerpt from Josquin de Prez, and there's one moment right here that sounds a lot like somebody just bashed down a hand on a keyboard. But it's very, very hard to find in a score. But with Music 21, we can reduce anything to chords and find immediately moments such as this that might be fingerprints of a particular composer's signature. With large corpora, we're able to also explore things like changing ideas about root motion in popular music. So if you look, these are the number of semitones. So you basically go up a fourth or go up a fifth or down a fifth in music of the 50s and 60s. What's changed after 1980? Well, you still go up a fourth, go up a fifth, but now more and more you go up that's walking bass by seconds. And so these are things that I've been going around there. So Music 21, I'll skip over some of these things because I have a little bit of problem there. So I'll get back to looking at how Music 21 works with MSAT. So I'm finally able to use my system to answer questions from my own repository. So I use the system to chop up every single piece into segments of approximately 30 notes in length. These segments overlap one another, so the position that they chop is not particularly important. From there, each of the segments is automatically transformed into a simple alphabetic code, similar to those pioneered in the projects of Mendel, Ham, and Lockwood in the 60s and 70s. And there are many possible indexes or codes that can be implemented. The code I've found most useful is encoding the name of the note without any accidentals, altered according to whether each note is longer, shorter, or the same length as the previous note. This is a way of reducing the data set. In this way, also, differences of metric reduction in editorial ficta are also reduced. So this is an example of one part of the first segment of Onkenefu encoded in that way. Now, in the MSEP database, there's about 188,000 segments of music. That opening that we just heard is labeled ID 154657, where it is unceremoniously stored in the data set like the Ark in that first Indiana Jones film. Next, the system compares each of this segment against some other segment. That's what's happening here. Here's two segments. And the program generates a series of operations necessary to transform one melody into another. In this case, the two melodies are highly dissimilar, so there's a lot to change. Finally, and most importantly, the system reduces all this information to a single number between 0 and 10,000, representing 0 to 100% similarity. Here, the melodies are only a measly 17% similar. but these are just 2 segments. In the next step, each of the 188,000 segments is compared to every other segment, resulting in about 35 billion comparisons, which takes about a day for a fast computer to run. I stored only those that were at least 50% similar, reducing it to a mere 814,000 pieces to look at. Each of these still has an audible level of similarity, but it's still far too much for me to investigate. So I narrowed my gaze to only those 724 pairs that were over 64% similar. And this was enough to keep me busy for about a year looking at all of them. Almost all of them are fascinating connections, worthy of talking about another time, that might be by the same composer and unknown. But for quotations and concordances for exact matches, I jumped up to about the 70% and the 80% similarity level. And in this case, nearly every case is a crystal clear example of musical borrowing. So about 181 cases of musical borrowing. But many of them had already been identified, but the computer does not read critical notes in the latest issue of early music history, so it showed them to me as if they were brand new. When I run the software, this is what it looks like, sped up about 3-fold. Results come in, scores are generated that show 2 fragments of music that might be related. I try to look at them, all the while other scores keep popping up. It's a tedious process, but it seemed to have worked for me. While I get some water and catch my breath, I want to show you how the search mechanism will take place once this paper is turned into a CSI episode. I really wish digital humanities looked like this. So let me slow down for a bit and look at some actual results. This is a screenshot showing part of a search for works in a Germanic manuscript called Prog 9. It found nothing above the 80% threshold until suddenly it found 5 segments that were connected between the same 2 pieces. And this segment is an isolated tenor in an English manuscript far separated. They don't look similar at all. There's a 6-to-1 reduction between the 2 transcriptions. They have different clefs, and the 2 works were chopped at slightly different places, like that. But when I return to the facsimile of the manuscripts, for those who read medieval and Renaissance notation, they're exactly identical. Now, the computer doesn't tell me anything about why this work was transmitted to 2 places so far apart, nor why it was transformed linguistically. It's in German in one source and in French in the other, nor why the Prague version would have been performed with multiple voices, or any of the other questions that will keep musicologists, librarians, and our training in business long into the digital age. And this is why I continue to be fascinated by musical theory. And I'd love to talk about what those things actually are, but the new discoveries have come back so fast, about 50 times in the last year, that I'll need to do that kind of discussion later to talk about some of the things that I'm finding. For instance, Johannes Ciconia is considered one of the most gifted and original composers around the turn of the 15th century, but it turns out he's not nearly as original as we previously thought. Here's a piece by him from a particular manuscript, and I'll start playing, and then I'll fade in another manuscript of a different piece. Oops, that should be fine. Over half of the Ciconia piece is identical to an anonymous German song called O Sinne Mein. The repetitions in the credo hint strongly that the secular piece came first. This will, in the end, be the oldest example of a technique called parody or parody mass, which becomes very important in the 15th and 16th century. Nobody thought to look for this technique at this time, and so it remained undiscovered. Let's skip a tiny bit further. In this case, there is a credo by a composer named Berlatus, whose cantus voice was found in one manuscript, and whose other voices were found in another manuscript. And therefore, each of these pieces was considered separate, but not overlapping, except that the computer was able to find, based on this one little fragment, where only about 8 or 9 notes were able to be discovered, and was able to connect the two pieces. Oops. Another heretofore unknown connection arose for a credo from a mass at the end of a London codex. Rather than being a direct copy from another credo or another secular piece, it's instead deeply linked with a Gloria of French origin. And this shows how much borrowing was going on and how erratically the borrowing was happening. So this will show each of the places where borrowing took place, with large gaps in between. And so these are the kinds of connections between the same two pieces that have completely gone unnoticed by scholars until the computational age. So I'm going to go through in 3 minutes as much as I can of the other things that are happening. We identified a collection of pen tests that's actually the second source of a piece in Switzerland. That piece that I was talking about at the beginning, Anke Nefu, ends up being discovered in a little fragment. Whole bunches of wiped out pieces that we could only identify a few notes here and there were able to be discovered. I'll skip over a few more. Let me just go on to talk about this particular one. This I find very interesting because this is a Gloria that was previously known only from Italian sources that I was able to find in Salzburg using only the rhythm incipit. So I didn't have access to the Salzburg manuscript or a facsimile of it. But this shows the amount of data that was actually necessary in order to make some kind of connection. If all we had was a few of the, the first interval goes down by fourth, then it goes down by second, then up by third, that wouldn't be enough. But I needed the rhythm to be identical, and at least usually 10, 12, or 14 notes in order to be able to figure out if two pieces are unique. For some people who are musicologists or who know this person, the most exciting discovery to come out of the work is a new identification of a motet by Guillaume de Machaut, his Bonnet Pastor, for which I can not offer all the certainties I would before, but many hypotheses. So let me begin by saying what we do know about this piece. In many cases, motet tenors come from existing chants and have incipits, that is the opening word, that identifies those chants. And in some cases, there's a connection between the subject of the chant and the subject of the piece. But in many cases, there are not. We also know that medieval musicians were masters of the art of memory and crafting, that is, grafting, putting together, or improvising lines that would work according to set movements of the tenor. So the evidence from MSAP and Music 21 suggests to me that the early 14th century composers chose to use their knowledge of counterpoint and their vast memory of previous motets and plain song to choose their tenors, optimizing their choices so that tenors similar to ones they already knew would allow them to employ similar compositional strategies. For instance, this is a different motet by Machaut, whose tenor is called Spiravi. If we compare that to one whose text is Dolor meus, which forms the tenor of two anonymous motets, we find that they're actually exactly identical if we take out the first note, probably allowing the composers of the later pieces to borrow from Machaut. There are other cases where it appears that the relationship between chant tenors is very close but might be a matter of chance. In this case, there's a 17-note correspondence between the second half of two different Machaut motets, but that actually falls within the realm of probability for how much Gregorian chant goes up, down, about 50% of the time. But the case of the last unknown Machaut tenor, Bonnet Pastor, motet 19, is not straightforward as either being completely certain or being the result of chance. The piece is the only one of Machot's motet to use the same name, the same incipit for the tenor and each of the top voices, Bonnet Pastor. And that's been the problem. We haven't been able to find any chant or any other song that begins Bonnet Pastor, good pastor, good shepherd. And the melody has not been found anywhere else until now. All but the first note and the last note are exactly in the same order, same pitch level, same melody as a previously composed motet that Machot could have been aware of, a late 13th century motet called Les Lormels m'en se lèvent, whose tenor is Je n'y songerai plus. Now this piece enjoyed some popularity into the second half of the 15th century, so we know it was still being copied around. But like before, the first and the last note have been removed. And if Machot wanted to disguise where he was borrowing from, that's quite understandable, because this is certainly not a sacred work in any means. The tenor, Je n'y songerai plus, reads something like a refrain from a lost Trouvère song, saying, I won't be wearing my sexiest belts anymore. My lover done got married. It's breaking my heart. And it was placed in the context of a piece whose upper voices talk about the marriage of Robin Hood and Marian, about kisses with shepherdess, and where the lovers desire to grind their oats while everyone else is asleep. Is there a second hidden meaning in Machot's motet? The problem is that this passage is exactly at the level where it could be chance with 5% probability, or 95% probability it's connected, but we don't know. That's really not enough for sure. But other composers, such as Periton, have reused long passages just cut in the middle of works in order to criticize bishops for having marital infidelities. So this is something that we know happened and may have been something that's happening here. All I know is that this refrain is now not a topic related to pastoral fidelity. It's the closest that we found so far to identifying this last unknown work by Guillaume de Machot. I'm going to conclude now with some implications for the more general point at hand, the creation of full-text musical databases and the use of computer technologies to identify connections among many pieces. Again, blank slide there. To begin, this technique would not have been successful at finding concordances and connections if there were none to be found. That so many previously unidentified works are in fact copies of already known pieces might be said to be a confirmation for a theory that Jared mentioned, that I published as tipping the iceberg, that a large proportion, probably the majority even, of written music of the 14th century actually still survives. And it may be possible to extend this further. Second, I've been focusing on quotation and concordance and that type of very close connection. And these things are very easy to confirm once they're pointed out. You see it, you see that it's identical. But the system of being able to work with full text databases also gives great information about similarities in musical style. Similarities, not exact connections, that can be used to aid in attributions of anonymous pieces and to decide among conflicting attributions. Preliminary work that I've done suggests the computer does very well at attributing pieces that we already know the correct answer to, about 90% accuracy. So when the field is willing to accept computational style analysis, we might be able to start putting names on the wide repertory of currently anonymous pieces. Finally, I've been working on the period from 1340 to 1420 because it's the period I know best. But none of the techniques I mentioned today use techniques specific to late medieval music. They can work on any large digitized repertory. Therefore, I want this paper to encourage other librarians, other libraries, and other scholars to create their own digital repertories, to which we can apply the same tools to understand relationships among works of music of other times and places. We all work in an interconnected field, one in which chains of influence and citations span the centuries and the continents. Our ability to illuminate such connections will grow as our openness to new tools, new databases, and new ideas grows along with it. Thank you. answer any questions anybody might have.
Is there an audio component?
Because everything is in Music XML, it's easy to create cheesy MIDI components for almost anything. But I think about 80% of the works have never been recorded. So there are there isn't that level of connection. But I would love to work with people to create more. In the back.
I was wondering how, if any, optical musical recognition or OMR stuff had played into your work, going back to those original scores you were talking about.
Thank you. So what I've done is my main repertory is about 1340 to 1410, but I know that at the fringes of that and so everything in there, why do I say I, as if I'm taking credit? My team and I have encoded by hand into the database. But then we know that people in 1340 may be citing works from before, or we might have missed data sites. So at the extremes, I've supplemented the human encoded repository with things that have been optical music recognition recognized. And it actually works so well that if I were to start again to do this type of project of looking at connections, I would probably start by running the OMR on everything and just get that level. Especially OMR compared to can find a connection with something that's been entered in by hand. But OMR to OMR connection, you're sort of multiplying errors. IMSLP, by the way, has it's been completely OMR'd by a site called peachnote.net, run by Vladimir Vero in Munich, and it's an incredible resource. And I hope we can all do more over time to improve that technology for being able to search. I think that people have had a very long day of listening to great papers up until this one, and would probably love to have 4 extra minutes before the concert. Thank you so much.